It began with harmless flirting, a playful bond between a father and his young son, a subtle touch, a shared glance. Then came the words that shattered the idyllic scene. "Hurry up, your brother shouldn't see this." What followed was a series of events neither of us could erase. The house was unnervingly quiet. Not a comforting quiet like a lazy afternoon, but a suffocating silence that clung to everything. It felt heavy, almost tangible, pressing against the walls and permeating the air. This house, once filled with warmth and familiarity, now felt alien, cold, distant. Something had undeniably shifted, palpable in every breath I took. I stood in the kitchen, not really doing anything. A cup of coffee sat untouched before me, my hands trembling slightly as they always did when the tension began to mount. I could hear Jamie moving in the other room, soft footsteps padding against the floor. He wasn't talking. He never did when the atmosphere grew heavy like this. He knew, just as I did, that something was amiss. It wasn't supposed to be this way. This house, our family, everything was supposed to be simple. I'd always been close to Jamie, closer than I ever anticipated. People say you can't have an intimate relationship with your children, that it's wrong to be too close, but they don't know us. They don't know what it was like losing my wife so suddenly, leaving me to raise Jamie alone. I had to be everything to him. Father, mother, protector, friend. It wasn't easy, but we managed. For years, it had been just the two of us, and I vowed to ensure Jamie never felt alone. But ever since Adam returned from college, something had changed. Something felt wrong. No matter how often I tried to deny it, I knew, and Jamie knew. We both felt the coldness, the anger radiating off Adam like a dense fog. He wasn't the same. He'd never been perfect, but this was different. He was distant, calculating, sometimes even cruel. The silence stretched, then Jamie's voice broke through, soft and hesitant, a whisper in the darkness. "Dad?" I turned, startled. My son, my little boy, stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide with unmistakable worry. Jamie had always been an open book, easy to read, and right now his eyes spoke volumes I couldn't quite decipher. "Where's Adam?" His voice was barely audible, as if uttering his name aloud made it real. I swallowed hard. I didn't want to answer, didn't want to admit the truth, but I couldn't lie to him either. "Upstairs," I mumbled. "Probably in his room, like usual." I watched Jamie's shoulders slump, his gaze falling to the floor. He was afraid. I saw it in the way his eyes darted nervously towards the stairs, as if expecting something terrible to emerge at any moment. It was absurd. He was only 14 and I was supposed to shield him from things like this, from the unease that permeated the house whenever Adam was around. But how could I protect him when I felt equally lost? The truth was, I had no idea what had happened to Adam. The boy I raised, the one who used to laugh and play with Jamie, the one who used to dream about his future, had become someone else, someone colder, darker. This wasn't typical teenage rebellion. It was something deeper, something I couldn't grasp, something dangerous. Adam wasn't just angry at the world, he was angry at us. And the worst part was, it wasn't just me he'd distanced himself from. Adam had been ignoring Jamie, too. At first, it was small things, short answers, avoiding eye contact. But gradually, Adam's indifference towards Jamie was palpable. It was as if his younger brother had become a complete stranger, a shift I was powerless to shield Jamie from. Witnessing the coldness in Adam's eyes, a detachment that churned my stomach, was agonizing. I could feel Jamie's gaze on me, searching for answers, for solace, but I was at a loss. What words could possibly mend this rift? What actions could bridge this growing chasm? I yearned to be the anchor, the one who could restore our family, but a creeping sense of dread and helplessness consumed me. "Dad?" Jamie's voice cut through the silence, a fragile plea that tightened my chest. "I don't like it. It's like he's not really here anymore. Like he's someone else." I closed my eyes, leaning against the kitchen counter, the weight of his words a crushing blow. My son, my youngest, was right. Adam had changed. He'd always been a bit of an enigma, but this was different. This wasn't typical teenage angst. It felt darker, more sinister. "I know, buddy," I replied, my voice strained. "I know." I wished I could offer more, some reassurance, some comfort, but the truth was I was just as lost. I didn't know how to fix this, how to fix him, and that terrified me more than anything. Jamie shifted nervously. "What if he..." What if he does something, Dad? The question lingered, a shadow refusing to dissipate. I wanted to brush it off, to tell him it was just a phase, that Adam would come around, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't lie when I felt the same chilling fear, the same unsettling premonition of something terrible looming. He's not going to hurt anyone, I said, but the words felt hollow even to my own ears. I wasn't sure what Adam was capable of anymore. Jamie looked up, and for the first time in a long time, I saw genuine fear reflected in his eyes, a fear that mirrored my own. It was the kind of fear no father should ever witness in his child, yet here we were, trapped in this house with a growing sense of unease. "I'm scared, Dad," Jamie whispered, and the weight of those words nearly broke me. I knelt down, meeting his gaze, cupping his face in my hands, the warmth of his skin a grounding sensation, a reminder of my role, of the promise I made to protect him. "Jamie, listen to me," I said softly. "You don't need to be scared. We'll figure this out. I won't let anything happen to you. You're safe. You're always safe with me." He nodded slowly, but the doubt lingered in his eyes. The air felt thick with unspoken anxieties. I didn't have the answers, didn't even know where to begin, but I couldn't let Jamie see my fear, couldn't let him see how lost and overwhelmed I felt. "Go to your room," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "Stay there for a while, okay? I'll handle things." Jamie hesitated, the internal struggle evident in his expression. The trust he had in me battling against the fear that gnawed at him, the fear that none of us were safe. "I'll be fine," I reassured him, though I wasn't entirely convinced myself. With a slow, reluctant nod, Jamie finally agreed. "Okay, Dad, but be careful, please." His words stung more than they should have. I watched him walk away, his small frame disappearing as he climbed the stairs. I wasn't sure how much longer I could maintain this facade, the pretense of control, the web of lies, but I had to. For Jamie, for his safety, for my own sanity, I turned back to the empty kitchen, the silence now deafening in Jamie's absence. Deep in my gut, the gnawing dread intensified. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and it wasn't going away. The problem wasn't confined to Adam. It permeated our entire family dynamic. But the most unsettling aspect was the uncertainty, the complete lack of foresight into how this would all resolve. The days blurred into one another, the subtle shift in our routine gradually morphing into an undeniable, inescapable reality. It began subtly, a slightly longer dinner, an extra hour of television, a quiet game of cards in the evening. But with each passing day, these small moments expanded, Jamie and I gravitating towards each other more than ever before. I couldn't discern whether it was a shared search for solace, a mutual distraction from the growing unease, or simply a natural progression, but our togetherness felt different, more pronounced. Jamie had always been a sensitive child, close to me, perhaps unusually so for a son and his father. It was a quiet, inherent bond, strengthened through years of shared experiences, especially in the aftermath of Sarah's passing. But recently, this connection had evolved, taken on a new dimension. It transcended mere comfort. It was deeper, more profound, though I struggled to articulate its essence. It started one evening as we settled in to watch a movie after dinner, a familiar ritual. I'd developed a habit of selecting older films, undemanding narratives to fill the silence. But that night, as I sat down, I noticed Jamie sitting closer than usual. Initially, I dismissed it. It wasn't uncommon for him to lean against me, but this felt different, more deliberate. His shoulder brushed against mine, and when he spoke, his voice was softer, more subdued. "Dad?" he started, his voice low, tentative. "Do you remember when Mom used to watch these movies with us?" I paused, a lump forming in my throat, struggling to swallow the emotions that threatened to surface. Years had passed since Sarah's death, yet the grief still felt raw, immediate. The space beside me, once hers, now felt perpetually vacant. "I do," I replied quietly, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "She loved these old movies." Jamie nodded, but didn't move away. He leaned in slightly, his head resting gently against my shoulder. It was a small gesture, yet I felt its weight, the palpable shift in the atmosphere. The moment felt charged, imbued with an unspoken significance I couldn't decipher. I shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to react. It had been a while since Jamie had been this physically and emotionally close. The movie continued, but I could tell Jamie wasn't truly watching. His attention was elsewhere, his hand brushing lightly against mine as he adjusted his position. The contact was fleeting, yet its impact lingered. It was as if he was seeking something, reassurance perhaps, or simply a sense of grounding amidst the changes that had enveloped us. My chest tightened. For a fleeting moment, I almost wished Adam were present, to disrupt the intensity, to shatter the fragility of the moment. Yet, simultaneously, I didn't want Adam anywhere near this. Whatever was transpiring between Jamie and me felt necessary, something we both craved. It was an unspoken solace, a way to fill the void left by all the things we couldn't articulate. Jamie's head rested a little heavier on my shoulder, and my heart ached with the weight of his proximity. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed these moments, how much I'd yearned for this quiet connection. It wasn't simply about providing Jamie with companionship. It was something more, something mutual, something I couldn't fully comprehend. It wasn't just about companionship anymore, it was about rediscovering a sense of wholeness, finding something genuine amidst the chaos that had become our lives. "Are you okay, Dad?" Jamie asked, his voice soft, hesitant. I turned slightly, meeting his gaze for what felt like the first time in an eternity. There was something in his eyes, an unspoken understanding that tugged at my heart. I couldn't define it, but it was palpable, an awareness neither of us had acknowledged before. "I'm fine," I replied, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. The truth was, I wasn't fine. I hadn't been for a long time, but Jamie didn't need that burden right now. He didn't respond verbally, but the intensity of his gaze spoke volumes. It felt like we were both poised on the precipice of something, waiting for the other to make the next move, to give voice to the strange emotion that was growing between us, but neither of us did. We sat in silence, the quiet hum of the movie filling the void. As the evening progressed, the silence became more comfortable. I couldn't recall the last time I'd felt this at peace, this connected to another person. Yet, it was also unsettling, as if we were treading a precarious line between normalcy and something different. The following night, it happened again. Jamie and I sat together at the kitchen table playing chess. I'd never been particularly skilled at the game, but Jamie enjoyed it, and he'd been patiently teaching me for months. As we sat across from each other, the chess pieces seemed insignificant compared to the unspoken tension that hung between us, a thick fog neither of us could dispel. Jamie's fingers brushed mine as he moved a piece, and once again I felt that jolt of awareness. It was a simple touch, easily dismissed, yet neither of us disregarded it. I looked up, meeting his eyes, and in that instant everything else seemed to fade away. The intensity of his gaze, the softness of his expression. It was as if he was asking me something without words, a question I wasn't sure how to answer. "Dad," Jamie said quietly, his voice barely a whisper, "do you think things will ever go back to normal?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. The question hung heavy in the air, fragile yet weighty. What even constituted normal anymore? Could things ever truly return to normal after everything that had happened, with Adam's distance and the growing tension in the house? "I don't know," I admitted honestly, my voice thick with emotion. "I really don't know, Jamie." He nodded slowly, as if anticipating my response. But there was a sadness in his eyes, a quiet yearning that tightened my chest. I wanted to reassure him that everything would be all right, that we would navigate this together, but I couldn't muster the conviction. As we continued the game, I noticed Jamie's movements becoming slower, more deliberate. His fingers lingered on each piece, and when our hands brushed again, it felt like an electric shock, both thrilling and terrifying. I didn't understand what was happening, but I couldn't pull away, and neither could he. And then, in a moment that altered everything, our lips met. The kiss was slow, tentative, as if all our anxieties had momentarily dissipated. His hands moved to my neck, then down towards my hips. It was a moment we both seemed to have been craving. "Hurry up," I whispered. "Your brother shouldn't see this," I said, attempting to hasten the moment. The night passed quietly, but the space between us felt smaller, filled with an unspoken something neither of us was ready to acknowledge. Whatever had shifted between us, we weren't prepared to name it, to confront it, not yet. But as the hours ticked by and we finally retreated to our separate rooms, I couldn't shake the sensation that we were teetering on the edge of something unknown, something simultaneously terrifying and comforting. It was clear now, Jamie and I were growing closer in a way neither of us could explain. We both tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but deep down, we knew that nothing would ever truly be the same again. The days that followed flowed with a quiet rhythm, an unspoken understanding between Jamie and me. We were seeking solace in each other, though neither of us could articulate it. Sometimes words weren't necessary to express the emotions we were both experiencing, emotions we had always felt but were only now beginning to understand. It wasn't just about filling the void left by Sarah's death anymore. It was about finding comfort in each other's presence in a world that often felt vast and empty. It began with something simple, almost mundane. A long drive into the countryside. I'd always found solace in driving, the freedom it offered to think without distractions. It was something I used to do with Sarah before life became complicated. But now, I found myself suggesting it to Jamie, as if escaping the confines of the house, the weight of our unspoken thoughts, might offer us both some respite. "Hey," I said one afternoon, standing in Jamie's doorway. He was sitting at his desk, eyes fixed on his laptop screen, but I could sense his restlessness, a restlessness that mirrored my own. "You want to take a drive, just the two of us? Clear our heads a little?" Jamie glanced up, his eyes brightening in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. A smile touched his lips, though it wasn't the same carefree grin he used to wear. This one was tinged with something more subtle, a quiet eagerness. Perhaps he'd been thinking the same thing. "Yeah, I'd like that," he replied softly, his voice almost a whisper, as if relieved I'd suggested it. We had no destination in mind, no real plan, just the shared desire to drive, to leave behind the heaviness that permeated the house whenever Adam was present, or whenever we allowed ourselves to acknowledge the weight of all that remained unsaid. We slipped into the car without another word, the hum of the engine filling the space between us. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced at Jamie. He was staring out the window, his profile illuminated by the soft afternoon sun. For a moment, he looked older than his years, more distant, as if carrying a burden he wasn't sure how to bear. "You okay?" I asked, my voice softer than intended. Jamie nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the passing landscape. "Yeah," he replied quietly, "just thinking." I didn't press him. I knew he didn't want to talk. Sometimes, silence was more eloquent than words. So we drove, the miles passing unnoticed as we let the world around us fade into the background. Music played softly, a familiar playlist Jamie had compiled a few weeks earlier. It was a mix of old rock and newer indie songs that seemed to perfectly capture our shared mood. Quiet, reflective, a little lost. We drove on, the silence between us comfortable, yet charged with an unspoken energy. We drove for what felt like hours, winding through country roads, past small towns and fields that stretched out like a vast green ocean. The farther we traveled, the more the tension in my shoulders eased. The simple act of driving, of having this time together, felt like a brief escape, a reprieve from the weight of our worries. I could see the same sense of relief washing over Jamie. We eventually stopped at a small diner on the outskirts of a sleepy town, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. It was a relic of a bygone era, with worn wooden floors, faded booths, and a menu that hadn't been updated in decades. We settled into a corner booth by the window, the glow of the neon sign outside casting a soft light on the table between us. The diner was nearly deserted, save for a few locals engrossed in their own conversations. I noticed Jamie had relaxed somewhat. His shoulders were no longer hunched, his eyes less distant. He was still quiet, but there was a newfound softness about him, as if he were slowly emerging from his shell. We ordered our food, and when the waitress brought it, I observed Jamie picking at his fries, more focused on the act of eating than the food itself. He was still lost in thought, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. I simply let him be. Finally, after a long stretch of quiet, Jamie spoke, his voice hesitant. "Dad, can we talk about what happened last night?" Yeah. "I think that's what we both needed," I replied softly, my voice thick with the emotion that had always simmered beneath the surface. "It is something that will heal us up." Jamie's gaze met mine, searching, as if seeking something in my words. "Yeah, but what if Adam comes to know?" "We'll handle it. Don't worry. It's where life wants to take us, maybe." Jamie's expression softened, and he gave a small nod, his fingers briefly curling around mine. The gesture was innocent, yet in that moment, it felt like everything. It was a promise, a silent agreement that no matter how fractured the world felt, we would still have each other. We finished our meal in relative silence, the weight of our conversation lingering in the air. When we left the diner, we didn't rush home. Instead, we took another long drive, this time with no particular destination, just the open road, the car, and the sound of Jamie's music filling the space between us. By the time we returned, the sun had set, and the house felt different, lighter somehow. The door closed behind us with a soft click, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the oppressive weight of silence that usually greeted us. As we stood in the hallway, coats still draped over our shoulders, Jamie glanced up at me, his eyes shining in the dim light. "Thanks for today," he said softly, his voice more confident than it had been in the car or at the diner. "I really needed that." I smiled, a genuine smile that reached my eyes. "Me too." And just like that, the world felt a little less heavy, not because everything was resolved or because we had all the answers, but because for a few hours we had simply been together. The next day, an unexpected invitation arrived. A party thrown by a family friend, someone I'd known for years, to celebrate the end of summer. Initially, I wasn't sure if Jamie would even want to attend. He'd been more withdrawn than usual, his social circle shrinking. But when I mentioned it, he surprised me. He agreed to go. He'd surprised me. His eyes had brightened, and he'd nodded with a quiet enthusiasm I hadn't witnessed in a while. "I could use a change of pace," he'd said. That was all it took. After some brief discussion, we found ourselves preparing for the evening. The night was warm, the air thick with the lingering scent of summer. We arrived at the house, a sprawling ranch on the edge of town where the party was already in full swing. The music was loud but not overwhelming, more of a pervasive hum that resonated in your bones. A mix of laughter, conversation, and the clinking of glasses filled the air. I glanced at Jamie as we walked up the steps to the front door. His eyes scanned the crowd, and he seemed a bit on edge, but not in the way he typically reacted in social situations. This was different. He wasn't withdrawing, he seemed to be processing, trying to find his place in the sea of faces. "You okay?" I asked softly. Jamie nodded, his expression more reserved than I expected. "Yeah, just wasn't sure what to expect." I placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll stick together. It's just a party." He gave me a fleeting smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. But it was something, a sign that he was at least making an effort. Inside, the atmosphere was different from what I'd anticipated. It wasn't a wild, chaotic scene, but rather a relaxed gathering. Some people were dancing near the living room, others were gathered around the kitchen island, chatting, and some were lounging by the backyard pool. The house was filled with a palpable warmth, both from the guests and the soft lighting. We grabbed drinks and navigated through the crowd. I noticed Jamie seemed to relax into the environment, observing the conversations around him. At one point, a familiar song began to play, a song we both enjoyed. It was one we'd often heard during our quiet drives together, one Jamie had shared with me. The music seemed to draw him in, and before I knew it, he was stepping forward, tapping his foot to the beat. "Come on, Dad," he said with a small smirk. "Let's dance." I blinked, surprised by his sudden invitation. He wasn't usually one for dancing, or at least he hadn't been before, but something in his tone, in the way he looked at me, made me feel like this was important. "I'm too old for dancing," I joked, raising an eyebrow. Jamie rolled his eyes but grinned. "I don't care. Let's just do it." There was a conviction in his voice that left no room for refusal. The weight of the moment was palpable, unspoken, but real. This wasn't just about dancing. It was about bridging the distance that had been growing between us, about embracing a moment of carefree joy. No judgments, no expectations, just the music and us. So I followed him onto the dance floor. The crowd around us seemed to disappear, and for a brief moment, I didn't care about anything except the rhythm of the music and the smile on Jamie's face. He wasn't self-conscious, and neither was I. We simply moved together, lost in the simplicity of the moment. The relaxed way he moved, the way he laughed when I attempted a clumsy spin, made it feel like the world had paused just for us. It wasn't a perfect dance. I stumbled once or twice, and I could tell Jamie was trying to suppress his laughter at my awkwardness, but it didn't matter. It was our dance, a shared moment in a sea of strangers, a moment that felt profoundly intimate. It was a moment that belonged solely to us. Eventually, the music slowed, and the crowd began to thin. Jamie and I wandered out to the patio for some fresh air, our hands still warm from dancing. "Thanks, Dad," Jamie said quietly, his voice low but filled with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. I needed that. Suddenly, his breath was warm against my face, close enough that I could feel the hesitation hanging in the air between us. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure he could hear it, but I couldn't move. Then, his lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, as if testing the waters. The softness of his touch sent a jolt through me, and before I could process it, I was leaning into him, closing the distance. His hand found my cheek, his thumb gently grazing my skin as the kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, yet charged with an unspoken intensity. Every sensation was amplified, the taste of him, the warmth of his body, the slight pressure of his hand steadying me. In that moment, nothing else existed but us. "You know," I said, sitting on the edge of a patio chair and glancing at him, "I needed that too." Jamie looked up at me, his expression soft. He hadn't spoken much all night, but the way he was looking at me now told me he understood. In that moment, amidst the noise and the crowd, we had found a small, private corner of the world where nothing else mattered. "I'm glad you came, Dad," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I wouldn't have missed it for anything," I replied, smiling back. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But as I looked at Jamie, there was something in his eyes that reminded me why we were doing this. To find these moments, to create memories, to show him that despite everything, we were still there for each other. And that was enough.